I just try to tell stories. And I think that that has been the key to the success I've had in the last 50 odd years.
Welcome to the Values Exchange podcast. I'm Mike Cruz, your host, author of Saturday Every Day, private pilot, and CEO of North Texas Wealth Management, a firm dedicated to values-based financial planning. Gold has always been the ultimate safe haven, but for our guest today, George Milling-Stanley, it's not just a commodity, it's been a calling. Over 5 decades, George became one of the world's foremost authorities on gold, helping launch the first U.S. gold ETF, guiding central banks and institutions, and becoming known as the GoldFather. Today, George joins us for his first reflection since retirement. We'll talk about what gold taught him, what he's learned about life, and where he's headed next. George, welcome to the Values Exchange.
Mike, it was a great invitation, and I'm very happy to be here for my first post-retirement gig.
Great, thanks so much. I was just looking today at the gold ETF, valued at over $88 billion. Just amazing. But I kind of want to go back to the beginning and even talk about this title, the GoldFather. I mean, I can think of many worse things to be called. But maybe I can't even think of anything better to be called. What a great title. So what does that mean to you, being called the GoldFather?
It reminds me of Bob Pisani, who's also recently retired from CNBC. I did an interview with him shortly after we launched GLD back in 2004. And he was the one who, he sort of struggled a little bit with the introduction because he was just so excited about the whole thing. But then he sort of stumbled on his words and came out with, I think he wanted to say the Godfather of Gold or something like that, but he came out with the GoldFather. And I figured, I can't think of a better name.
Right.
So I've embraced it. I've mentioned it in meetings. I've used it from time to time. I think it was a wonderful thing to be called. I don't know whether I deserve it, but Bob Pisani thought I did, and everybody thinks that he's the real deal. So, I'm happy to wear that with pride, no question about it.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, 5-decade career. Looking back, what do you consider yourself? A strategist, a storyteller? How do you kind of reflect back on all those decades?
Well, I'm going to be boring and say both. There's no question about that. But look, strategist has been my title for the last decade or so while I've been at State Street Investment Management. That's a pretty good title to have. But I started life, essentially professional life, as a journalist. And I believe I've always been a storyteller. I think everybody likes narrative. They like the narrative arc. People want to know where things start and where they get to, and then where they wind up. And I think that to my mind is crucial, to be able to tell a good story. That's how you keep people's attention. I don't give them facts and figures. I can always send those on later. I just try to tell stories. And I think that has been the key to the success I've had in the last 50 odd years.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, help me understand, like you went into journalism and then you ended up in gold. So, what were you initially wanting to do, and how did you make that transition? What brought you to even be involved in gold market?
Yeah, my father always wanted to be a journalist. He wanted to be a reporter. He never quite made it. He went into the printing trade and thought that he would gradually work his way up, but he actually enjoyed the printing trade and was a success at it. So he never followed through. I always thought, it looks to me like a career that beats working for a living. That's the way that I tended to look at it. The way that it started was I was sitting in my office. If it helps you to cast your mind back to August of 1972, and if it helps you to do that, I wore my hair in an afro at the time. Things have changed in the last 50 some years. But the editor of the magazine came to the door of my office and he said, "George, it's been 12 months since President Nixon closed the gold window. What do you think of that?" And I looked up at him and said, I haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about. I don't know what that means. And he said, good, I'm glad you don't understand it. I don't understand it either. I just read a headline in The Economist.
Hmm.
He said, but it occurred to me if you and I don't understand it, then probably our readers don't understand it either. We're a monthly magazine. You've got 3 weeks to deadline. Go find out about gold and write me a story. And I went off and I talked to 200, 250 people. At 25 years old, I was a very diligent reporter. I was very good at what I did.
Wow.
And I think that probably 5 or 6 of them made real sense and told me something of value. And I think that that's a ratio that has remained unchanged to the present day. If you listen to 250 people or read 250 people about gold, you'll find that maybe no more than 5 or 6 of them actually make sense. There's a lot of misinformation, disinformation out there. But what that persuaded me to do after my 3 weeks and then that story that I wrote, which disappeared completely. It's not anywhere that I can find it on the internet. We didn't have computers in those days. The magazine folded a few years later after I'd moved on to the Financial Times. So I hope nobody's ever able to find that, because when I was 25 years old, Mike, I knew all the answers. Now I just hope I'm asking the right questions. So good news is that I don't think anybody's ever going to be able to find that story. But what it did, the 5 or 6 people that told me things that I thought were of real value persuaded me it'd be a good idea to buy some gold, and I bought some gold coins. I lived in London at the time. You couldn't buy gold coins in 1972 in the US because there was still a ban that had dated from Roosevelt's time. But I was able to buy a handful of gold coins, and I think that's been part of my investment ever since.
Nice, nice. And so, we think of gold as like this safe haven, and I think you are expressing all the wisdom that you have after 5 decades of being able to ask the right questions. I like that. So what is that Gold Council? What is their role?
Yeah, they are essentially a promotional organization, and they're funded by voluntary contributions from the gold mining companies. And of course, they also get some income from GLD, from the expense ratio. And their remit, when they were set up in 1987, and their original remit was to try to work with the jewelry industry, holding design competitions and doing co-op advertising and stuff like that. They worked with the investment business, which was then basically small bars and coins. They worked with gold in technology by financing chairs and professorships at various universities and stuff. And they worked with the central banking community, basically trying to persuade those central banks that had a lot of gold to retain it, and those central banks that didn't have a lot of gold, primarily in the emerging markets, to start acquiring gold. And it was that last job that was essentially mine for the 15 years that I worked there.
And so, during those times, as you reflect back, 2008, even COVID more recently, your 5 decades of experience with, investing, and how do you is there one of those that you learned the most from?
I think, yeah, probably, Black Monday, 1987, that was a very important period. And basically, my thought is always that people should have properly balanced investment portfolios. I'm sure that you'd endorse me saying that.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure that that's what you talk to your clients about. They should have properly balanced investment portfolios with a certain amount of equity and some fixed income and other things, including perhaps some real estate, perhaps some general commodity exposure, and certainly I think some gold exposure. And I think that was the big lesson that I learned from my relatively small investments all those years ago. But I was away when this all started to happen. I was driving back to London. I'd been at a company offsite way down in the West Country, and I was several hours away. And there was a hurricane had ripped through the southwest of England at the same time. We were much more worried about the hurricane damage and trying to avoid fallen trees and fallen power lines than we ever were about what was going on in the market. It was only when we got back and I realized that I would probably have been selling my stocks. I didn't sell my stocks because the prices were already very depressed by the time I had access to the right level of information. No cell phones, for example, you know. Um, and so what I did was absolutely nothing. And very, very quickly, the stocks recovered in value and have gone on to all kinds of inconceivable highs ever since then. So in a crisis, very often, as long as you're properly prepared, the best thing to do is absolutely nothing. That was one of the biggest lessons I ever learned.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Diversification. If you're going to do something, it has to be done ahead of time. And once the crisis hits, weathering the storm with your diversified portfolio is really the best thing you can do. Avoid those knee-jerk reactions. I mean, it enhances the investor's return significantly.
Yeah.
It's great advice. So reflections. You talk a lot about really your career as a story, and looking back, what would you hope that your long career, what was the greatest impact as you kind of reflect back, and that you hope that you're remembered for?
Wow. That's a huge question, and I'm in retirement, I'm starting to think about things like that and starting to think back over the career. Um, Look, I think that my work with central banks while I was at the World Gold Council, I think that that was important, and I'm fascinated and inspired to see that it is still bearing fruit even all these years later. So that definitely was one. But I would also like to say that the past decade, which I've spent with State Street Investment Management, um, I've been given a lot of autonomy, which was very nice of them, given that my advanced years, I suppose, but to some extent, and my experience. Um, but it's been the best job I've ever had, and that was part of what helped me to decide that maybe this was the time to hang up my spurs and hand off to younger people. Um, Maybe it's time for me to step aside and let other people pick up the reins.
I think as you're talking about, the next kind of generation of people coming up from, right after you, what do you hope, if you could give them advice, with that experience? I know that, I'm talking to my kids that are in college, they're trying to figure out what they, want to do for their career. And, it's just like sitting there, you obviously didn't know that you would end up where you are today. And, these younger folks that are just starting in their career or following behind in your footsteps may not end up, knowing, if I ask the question, where is gold headed over the next 50 years? The answer is probably like, well, nobody knows. But what do you hope, or what advice would you have for them following in your footsteps?
It is kind of interesting to think about. If I were writing my life story, the first sentence would probably be, "How on earth did we wind up here?" And then I would do my best to tell the story. If I had to give, I mean, there's a couple of pieces of advice. One would definitely be open, keep your eyes open, keep your ears open, and keep your mind open to new ideas. That is absolutely crucial. And if there were one sentence, I read a book a long time ago, and it was called The Day No Pigs Would Die, and it was about a farmer in Vermont. And I'm sure that you understand that all farmers in Vermont are very, very wise. There's no question about that. It's the stereotype. And the one advice that this farmer gave to his young son, I think his son was about 8 or 9 years old, the one piece of advice that the farmer gave his son was never miss a chance to keep your mouth shut. And I thought, that was the secret of any success I had as a journalist. I was 10 years on the Financial Times after I left my financial magazine, and I learned to listen. I learned to listen a lot. This may seem unusual from, me as somebody who talks an awful lot, because that's what I've done in your company. But I was also listening, and I was listening to what you were saying, listening to the message that was coming through from the questions you were asking me and your colleagues were asking me. Listening is it's the only way you learn anything, man. So I think that never miss a chance to keep your mouth shut is one of those pieces of advice that I've done my best to adhere to throughout my career.
No, I think that's great advice. And, have talked a lot about that, where 70% of everything that's said, most people actually don't even hear or don't process, and so it's one of those difficult skills of truly listening and kind of leaning in, and you can learn a lot. And I think that's great advice for the next generation coming up. And being willing to learn from, somebody in your shoes that can mentor and take advice early on. I think that's really, really valuable. And I kind of learned that early in my career. It's, get in and learn the actual trade, not the tricks of the trade. That can come later, but, get in and learn the best practices, and then you can question them or learn the tricks of the trade later. But I think too many times people try to take that shortcut early, and they kind of miss out on all the little things that, the mentor is actually trying to teach you.
Yeah, you got to put the work in, Mike, right? I think that you and I both learned that a long time ago.
Yeah. It's good. So let's talk about retirement. Retirement's very recent for you. Many of our clients that are going into retirement, I think, it can kind of feel like a free fall. You're turning off the paycheck. You're going to this new chapter. We sometimes think of retirement as an end, but it really is just the beginning of, a new phase in life. So how are you doing with that transition, and what do you hope that retirement brings you?
A lot of people have said, so, you're going to want to do a lot of travel. You're going to want to, you're going to want to pass on your experience. You're going to want to mentor people. These are the things, and I think, no, that's what I've been doing my whole professional life. I've spent most of the last 30 some years. I've been married to my wife now for 33 years. And I've spent most of that time, 30, 35, sometimes even 40 weeks of the year on the road. And that is a terrible thing to look back on. She's had to be, she's had to be the homemaker, even though she was also working. But I just simply wasn't there for an awful lot of that. So no, I'm not looking to do an awful lot of traveling. I've got three goals. I'm a good cook. I love cooking, and I love to grow my own herbs and so forth. I'd love to do that, but I want to be a better cook. So that's one. I want to be a better cook. The second thing is I'm a terrible gardener. Most of my life I've lived in apartments, so I didn't have a yard to think about. My last house in London, I neglected the yard terribly, and it was a real mess. My house now that I live a little upstate New York, again, my yard is a complete mess. I want to become a good gardener. I'm a lousy gardener. I want to become a good one. And the third thing I'm going to do, because I'm going to be home, look, during COVID, I was grounded, right? My wife and I were together 24/7. And we discovered after 30 years of marriage that we actually rather liked being in each other's company 24/7. So I'm going to become a better husband, because I'm actually going to be present, and I'm going to be doing the cooking, and I'm going to be doing the gardening and all of those fun things, so that she can be free to write, which is what she does. She's a creative writer.
Nice.
And those are my goals. Those are my goals. I'm not looking to, rush off to Asia, rush off to beaches and whatever it may be. I'll do some travel because, most of my family still lives in England. My son and his wife, my daughter and her husband, the three grandsons that they've collectively given me. And I love to see them. But what I've always said is, you come to me. I travel for business the whole time. You come over here and we'll show you bits and pieces of America. So Niagara Falls, Grand Canyon, Youngstown, Jamestown, all of that good stuff. We've had a lot of fun doing visits, and educational for me too, as an immigrant to this country, right?
Okay. Nice. Well, it sounds like you're planning it right. Obviously, long career, successful, and now you get to really reap the benefits and do exactly what you want to do with your time. So wish you the best in retirement. Lots of reflections, lots of great ideas today. If you could leave behind one or two maybe big lessons for, let's just say, your great grandchildren that you may never meet, what would be your advice?
It goes back to my time on the Financial Times, but it's a bit of a long story, Mike, but I'll do my best to keep it relatively short. I'm not going to mention any names because that would be invidious, but I was interviewing someone who was the son-in-law of one of the titans of industry. And he was on his way up in the firm, as you might expect. These days, you'd call him a nepo baby, right? Nepotism is a terrible sort of thing. I think he deserved what he was getting, but for some reason, while I was talking to him, the notion of the headline for my story in the Financial Times, "The son-in-law also rises," I thought that that would be hilarious. And so I wrote my story, which was praising the guy and pointing out his good qualities, but I put this headline on it, and it went off to the sub-editing crew at the Financial Times, a bunch of grizzled old former reporters, most of them. And a little while later, one of them actually, instead of picking up the phone and asking me to go to him, he came over to my desk and he sat down in the chair across from my desk, and he said, "I'm not going to use your headline." He said, "You're making fun of the guy. You actually liked him. It's clear from the piece you wrote. The headline doesn't fit the piece you wrote. I'm not going to use it." He said, "And I'm going to remind you of one thing, that you work for the Financial Times. That gives you certain privileges. It gives you the privilege of being able to go and interview people. You pick up the telephone and say, 'I'm from the Financial Times.' Oh, yes, who do you want to speak to?" It was a wonderful, wonderful baptism in the journalism business. He said, "But remember that it's a privilege. Don't make fun of the people that you're writing about. Don't ever do that. Don't ever try to debase them. Just don't do it." And I never forgot that guy. He's probably long gone now. He was a lot older than me at the time, but he was also a lot wiser, and he gave me some of that wisdom, which I think is important. So all of my life has been a privilege.
Gold has tremendous value, but we're reminded, the true value. You talk about the values, life, and those lessons, and really just treating other people the way you want to be treated. I think that's great advice. And so, as always, success speaks loudest when it's based on values. Thanks for listening.